What's up, everybody? Maddox here, and welcome back to one of my fireside chats for the Pokestorian. Uh, had another topic I wanted to discuss with all of you today, and it's something I've kind of been seeing online for a while now, but I've really been trying to collect my thoughts on exactly how I feel about it and how I want to express how I feel about it to you all. And that's the topic of vintage Pokemon cards versus modern Pokemon cards. Because it seems like whenever I'm online right now, there's always like this animosity between like the people who like vintage and the people who like modern. And a lot of times I don't understand why that has to be the case. Like, why can't we just appreciate all the different cards? And I think about like when this kind of really started, and that would have been around the time of COVID. And of course, during that time, we had the big Pokemon boom for vintage cards. And in that case, they took off considerably. Everybody was super into them. And I think some of the people who didn't have those cards and were watching these older cards grow in price, I think it was frustrating for them to see like certain people, especially, typically be people my age or a little bit older, just kind of having their cards grow and grow in value, while the newer collectors who had cards, their cards weren't growing as much. So I do think that's kind of maybe where the divide started. And of course, some of the vintage people, their idea was like, oh, well, all these new cards, they're not worth anything. Like, why would you buy all these new Pokemon cards? Like, they're going to be worthless. The only thing that's worth money are the Pokemon cards that came out years ago, because there's not as many of them. And of course, it's hard to find clean copies of them and all that kind of thing. And I think there is some truth to that with vintage. Like, there are a lot fewer clean copies of some of these cards out there, because back when I was a kid and when some of you were kids, we didn't really take care of our cards like that. Running around and taking them in sprinklers, taking them to kids' sleepovers, and doing whatever the heck we wanted with them. But the truth is, around the end of the vintage boom, the pendulum swung and vintage fell out of favor, and then modern cards started becoming popular. And I think that really kind of happened around the time of the alt arts and when that started coming out. So that would have been like probably, I think, really around the time Battle Styles came out and moving forward. And of course, there were a few chase cards before that. You had the Champions Path Charizard and things like that. But really in 2021, I would say that vintage truly started falling out of favor and modern started really creeping up, especially Sun and Moon cards started taking off a lot, and people really started appreciating the modern cards. And of course, that makes sense because, I'll be real with you. Like, the artwork on these modern cards is just fantastic. We have these full arts now where they have like an illustration that covers the entirety of the card. You just didn't have that back in the old days. So it's hard for, at least from an artwork perspective, for at least to some level, for the vintage cards to compare with these. So with alt arts, and of course now we have the illustration rares, the artwork did take off. And that really kind of helped pump the modern cards. And also, it kind of gave people a chance who didn't have these old vintage cards sitting around. It gave them the chance to find something that they could get in the store that would have value. So you really saw a lot of these modern cards take off, and rightfully so to some level. It's really cool. I love getting the modern cards. There's so many fantastic artworks out there now that, I'm finding something that I want to get like almost every week. And of course, there's always new spoilers for all the new sets. Those always look really cool. But anyway, so then the pendulum swung, and then it started becoming like, well, vintage cards, those are gross. Those cards aren't cool. Like, look at these vintage cards. All they have is like a little picture of the Pokemon, and then like the whole card's not even an artwork. Like, why would I want that? And I get it to some level. Look, it's hard. You can't go back in time and like make these older cards like have an illustration that covers the entirety of the card. But that was around the time when everything really kind of swung the other way. And with that too, Charizard had been the chase card that had been the card that everybody sought after for years and years. And with Evolving Skies, of course, he was replaced by Umbreon, of course, with the Umbreon VMAX, and the V2 is also a very nice card and still kind of underrated in my opinion. I always liked that V more than the VMAX. But that's besides the point. So Charizard was dethroned, and the Umbreon became the king, and of course now Umbreon's king in this new set, Prismatic Evolutions, as well. So that was kind of like the nail in the coffin for like, vintage falling out of favor. And then, to this day, I still see stuff online saying like, oh, vintage will never come back. These cards, they're just going to stagnate. They're overvalued and they're never going to be able to compete with the modern cards. And to that I say, I don't agree with that at all. I just don't see it. I think that a lot of the modern cards are going to continue to hold value because the artwork is phenomenal and there's so many new people that are in the space. But y'all, a lot of these vintage cards, like, there's not that many out there, and I get that, the artwork maybe can't compete with having like a full art on there like the Squirtle. But even if like the artwork like isn't covering the entirety of the card, I mean, even though it's a smaller picture, I think, for example, this vintage Squirtle right here, I mean, that's a really cool artwork. Yeah, it's not a full art card like this Squirtle, but I mean, it still is really nice. And I like looking at this card just as much as this one. And I've gotten both of these cards within the last year. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is, like, don't count vintage out yet. I think there's room in the hobby for both to grow and for both to do well. You don't have to take sides, be like, oh, I'm modern only, like all those vintage boomer cards. No, we're not touching those. Or be like vintage, like, oh no, my cards are really valuable because they're really old and there's not as many of them. I mean, there's validity to both points. The artwork has continued to grow over time, but again, there is some rarity and there's a lot of historic value and still good artwork in the vintage cards. So, if you like the cards, you like the cards. Collect what you like, but neither side, whether you lean more vintage or lean more modern, don't count the other side out because otherwise you're just going to miss out on really cool cards. The hobby is full of cards from the vintage era through like the middle era, which would be black and white and diamond and pearl and all that, to now. There's good cards all around, and always be open to looking at new cool cards because I guarantee you will always find something new. Anyways, thanks for watching. That's all I wanted to say, and I'll see you in the next video.